Welcome to the podcast, Scattered, One Person's Search for the Story Behind Human Remains. My name is Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical anthropologist and archaeologist. In other words, I like dead people. In this podcast, I explore topics related to dead people, from searching for human remains in forensic contexts to mortuary practices in modern and archaeological contexts, and everything in between. I offer information, perspectives, and insights directly from the mouths of researchers, as well as experiences of people who work with remains. All of this aims to provide you with information on subjects that aren't really talked about, don't seem to be a priority, or they can be very misunderstood. I hope you enjoy. Hello, dear listener, and welcome once again to another episode of Scattered. It's lovely to have you here. Some notes today before we get started into the interview. The interview is with Robyn Lacy. Robyn has the website spadeandthegrave.com, and she and her husband also head up Black Cat Cemetery Preservation out of Newfoundland. So it's lovely to have her on today. The interview will be on in a moment. And we were recording, she was in Newfoundland, and for some reason we had to do... The recording kept crackling. The internet kept going south on us. So we had to do the interview a couple of times. So I'm hoping that the recording is good for you and you can listen in. I noticed in the Globe and Mail a couple weeks ago, sometimes I'm a little behind on my newspaper reading, Friday, January 12th, on page 2, new findings link origins of multiple sclerosis to DNA from bones, teeth of ancient Europeans, by Will Dunham. And I'll just read you the first paragraph here. DNA obtained from the bones and teeth of ancient Europeans who lived up to 34,000 years ago is providing insight into the origin of the often debilitating neurological disease, multiple sclerosis, finding that genetic variants that now increase its risk once serve to protect people from animal-borne diseases. It kind of affirms that looking at the past can help inform our present and our future, and not just past things, but also past people. So if anybody out there is an archaeologist, a biological anthropologist, historian, whatever, and you're always up against the question from friends or family asking you, why do you study the past? This is a good reason why. Otherwise, in news, one last thing, I did a presentation for the Canadian Association for Biological Anthropology back in October 2023. I believe that session was not recorded, and if it was only available to CABA members. It's now available on YouTube, and it's entitled, Start with the Why, How My Research in Scattered Remains Turns into a Podcast. So if you were wondering why I started this podcast, it gives you a little bit of background, including an overview of the Sandra Levy case. Go have a look. I have a YouTube channel, Yvonne Chorlin, and you can go look for it there. This is a gentle reminder that this podcast is not monetized. I do not receive any compensation from ads. And because I want this to be publicly available, free information to everyone out there. However, if you find this podcast and the information in it useful, please do consider supporting it by donating. You can donate through Buy Me a Coffee. Buy Me a Coffee is a platform through which you can donate the cost of a coffee, $5, $10, very small amounts, and the money goes directly to me to support my time. And my time on this podcast is significant. I spend a lot of time reading journal articles and books to find interviewees and stay current in many fields. I also do the post-production of this podcast, including the editing and the transcripts and chasing away very mouthy cats. So if you enjoy this podcast, please do consider buying me a coffee. The link is in the show notes and also on my website, yvonnechorlin.com. If you want to ask me a question or you have a comment or you have a story about working with remains and the dead, please do reach out. I'd love to hear from you. You can reach me through my website, yvonnechorlin.com, or email me at ychorlin@gmail.com. That's YKJORLIEN @gmail.com. You can also contact me through my Facebook page, Reluctant Archaeologist, and through Instagram at Yvonne Chorlin. Now, here is the interview with Robyn Lacy. So that I cannot mess up your name, and tell us who you are, where you're at, and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so my name's Robyn Lacy. I'm a Ph.D. candidate in the archaeology department at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. My research is looking at 17th century burial landscape development in Northeast North America. And I also run a business with my partner where we do gravestone conservation in the Atlantic provinces in Canada.
So, what brought you to this? Because this isn't the normal sort of archaeology stuff that I hear about in Canada. People always want to dig,
hmm
and you're not really digging.
yeah, I mean, I guess we dig around the bases of gravestones, but it's not traditional archaeology in the sense that most people think of it. Yeah, so like I originally got into burial ground archaeology and mortuary archaeology through a field school that I did in my undergrad. And like everyone has to do a field school usually for an archaeology program, and I decided that I wanted to do mine abroad. I was at school in Calgary, and I went to a field school in Ireland and on the Isle of Man through the University of Liverpool. And while we were in Ireland, we were surveying burial grounds to like transcribe the inscriptions on the headstones and document the gravestones as well, and do mapping of the site and that kind of thing. And I just thought that was the most interesting thing possible. That was not the avenue of archaeology I was intending to go into at all. And I thought that was just like such a fascinating area of research, and it really stuck with me. So it's what I've been doing in grad school. And then with learning about burial grounds, to me, it makes sense to have learned about their conservation as well. And there's very few people that have an archaeology background in Canada that do historic like stone restoration and graveyard work as well. So they go really well together for that.
Cool. So you did this field school. So I'm going to ask you to, take your memory back to when you were in
Yeah.
Ireland doing archaeology, which sounds amazing and wonderful. But you've also had this amazing opportunity to see archaeology on both sides of the Atlantic.
hmm
Are there differences, or is archaeology no matter where you go?
I think the basis is the same. Like it all comes from the same ideas, but the ways that we operate for, especially excavation, like excavation techniques, are a lot different in the UK and in Ireland. You'll see sites being opened, like they'll take all of the topsoil off at once, and you'll do like a row of people troweling the entire surface together. Whereas here we're more likely to open like 1 meter units or smaller trenches like that. So the way that like sites get approached is a little bit different. But also like when you're in Europe, you have this depth of structural heritage that goes back a lot farther. Like indigenous structures are a lot different than the stone buildings being built in Europe a couple hundred years ago to thousands of years ago. So there's a lot of like differences and approaches to older sites as well, I think.
Right. Yeah, we don't really have those stone walls here, do we?
Mhm. They're really nice.
It's nice when you hit, you're digging and you hit on something stone, because
hmm
when that happens, at least in Alberta, it's like, oh, it's either, just another rock glacial till, or, possibly maybe even a stone tool. There's no stone walls here.
Yeah, and like I love seeing like post hole features and that kind of like changes to the ground like that. But it's really exciting when you find like something structural that's very clearly structural and that's still standing.
Right, cool. Yeah, yeah. For
hmm
that reason, I like doing historic archaeology because of the
hmm
structural aspect. Yeah, seeing
Me
where the
too.
walls are and the post holes, and yeah, that's always cool.
Yeah.
So let's get into your research a little bit. So well, let's first start off with some definitions. The difference between a burial site and a graveyard and a cemetery.
Yeah. So, I mean, in different parts of the world, they have different meanings, of course. So this is mostly for North America. Cemetery is in our context, a site that is typically municipally owned, or if they're owned by a church, they're often non-denominational. And it means a certain type of site. It's sort of more rural. It's usually on the edge of town. It's sort of park-like. They come from this idea in the late 18th century, and it was called the rural garden cemetery. So they were planned, organized, but not in the same way that you would see rows in like an older site. There are larger monuments, there's bushes and like wide paths. It's supposed to have this park-like atmosphere. And that design style didn't come to North America until the 1830s. I want to say 1834, possibly, or around there, with the construction of Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So if we're being really annoyingly technical, anything before that date in North America is not considered a cemetery. But a cemetery is the colloquial word for like most burial sites these days. Graveyard then, or churchyard, is the grounds traditionally surrounding a church where the dead are buried. Sometimes they're not directly around the church, that can be like right next to it, but that's what the graveyard is. And then in North America, burial ground can be used as a catch-all term, but in the Northeast, specifically for like the Puritans and the Quakers, they used burial ground historically to denote a site that they were burying their dead in, but they were trying to do this separation of like church and everything else. They didn't even call their spaces where they had services of church. They called it the meeting house. So the burial ground was something that was not sacred. That's just where your mortal remains went. It didn't really matter after that. So they didn't call it a graveyard specifically to say that it was not associated with the church.
So, with this creation of cemetery and this park-like atmosphere, it almost sounds like back in the 1930s when this was started, at least in North America, that there was almost a desire to promote a relationship between the living and the dead. Would that be accurate to say?
Um, Somewhat, yeah, in the 1830s. But yeah, there was it sort of came from this concern that people were having with overcrowding in burial grounds that were in the centers of communities. And there's a lot of articles about this happening in like New York and places like that, that were more urban centers, Boston as well, where they were like, oh, we have too many people buried in these sites. It's getting smelly. It's going to be making people sick, even though that's not how dead bodies work. Um, that was something that they thought was going to affect them. So they were like, no more burials in the city. We're going to create these specific spaces outside of the city to bury our dead in. And in Europe, where the cemetery, rural garden cemetery movement comes from, it started with, and I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but Père Lachaise, which is outside of Paris. And that's the first garden cemetery. So it's really the model that they were all based off of. And it encouraged people to visit the sites and spend time there, but not a connection to, I would say, not a connection to interacting with the space in the same way that it was 100 or 200 years before that, because it was also removing it from people's daily like viewscape, I would say. Like you're not walking by a rural cemetery every day. It's not something that you're seeing on your way to the market or on your way home from work, because it's no longer in the center of that town. It would have to be like a purposeful trip out there.
I just find that interesting that, they want to make it more park-like and more palatable to the
Mm-hmm.
living, but yet at the same time, they're not really encouraging, a more engaged relationship with the dead.
Yeah, it's interesting because like yeah, it's a park, but then it's not very easy to get to for some people. Um,
Yeah, it's just interesting that they would go out of their way to make cemeteries, into park-like spaces, make them more palatable, but yet not really be encouraging, I guess, a deeper relationship with the dead, because these spaces are removed from urban centers, so you have to
mhm.
travel to get to them, but yet they're nicer.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with the 19th century idea of like softening of death. It's often referred to in literature, where you go from seeing these like 17th, 18th century gravestones that have like the skull on them and the hourglass, and they're like memento mori, remember you shall die, to the more like, yeah, early 19th century into the Victorian period of like, there's a willow tree to denotes sorrow, and there's like a mourning figure next to an urn. There's a lot of classical imagery, a lot more, I'd say, romanticized. The language changes a lot, and that's really what we're seeing being used in these park-like atmospheres. It's more of a calm, romanticized space.
So it almost sounds like, I don't know, I don't know how to put this into words, but uh, taking the opportunity to use a burial ground as a I don't know, maybe a reason to create a park, if that makes sense, instead of, kind of the other way around.
Yeah, it could very well be like a way to create, yeah, like a public space that's accessible to everyone while also solving some of the issues of where to put dead people. I'm not too sure about, like, I don't do too much with like 19th century landscape stuff, so I'm not sure about their like wider development, but yeah.
Right, cool. Okay. Okay, well, let's talk about what you are doing. So your the time frame, the geographical area, and then also the groups that you look at in your research.
Yeah, for sure. So my PhD dissertation research is on 17th century burial grounds. So I'm really interested in sort of the sites that were established when settlers first arrived in North America, when they were coming from settlements that they lived in for hundreds of years, that had been organized for ages. They probably don't even know why things were in certain places in the communities, to a place that they viewed as completely empty. Obviously, it's not. But when they arrived in North America, they were setting up a community for the first time, and they got to choose where everything went in that community. And what I'm really interested in looking at is how settlers chose to develop the space where they were placing their dead amongst where they were living and where their daily activities were. So I was looking at settlements founded by the British, the Dutch, and the French in the Northeast. So from northern Virginia up to Nova Scotia, and then into Newfoundland, along the coast, and then sort of along the St. Lawrence River Valley and the Hudson River Valley. And looking at how the early settlements from the 17th century there, yeah, how they established their burial grounds, and then comparing them, sort of like what were different religions doing and what were the different nationalities doing, and if there were any differences seen between those groups, or were they like sort of, was there sort of like a European conglomerate idea of what to do with your dead, and sort of those kind of themes overall.
So what were people doing with their dead? Because, there are different time frames and different places across the world even now where people are very much in relationship with the dead. I mean, there's even some time frames where cultures would bury their dead under the houses, under the floors of their houses, and actually,
Mm-hmm.
live, do their daily living on top of their dead. So tell us a little bit about the Dutch, the British, and the French, and how they used the spaces and how they maintained or divorced themselves from a relationship with their dead.
Yeah, so it was pretty interesting. Like, the Dutch and the French, we'll start with them. What Their settlements were very homogenous based on religion. So the Dutch were all represented by the Dutch Reformed Church, which was a branch of the Protestant Church after the Protestant Reformation in Europe, which sort of helped form the Netherlands. So that's a whole other thing. But the Dutch Reformed Church was the state religion, and that's what you see reflected in the colonies, aside from a couple of Jewish burial grounds as well. So they were all Protestant, basically. And then the French towns, even after the Reformation, Catholicism remained the dominant religion in France. And it was everyone had to be Catholic in the French settlements as well. So we have this Catholic conglomerate, we have a Protestant conglomerate, and then the British towns, they had freedom of religion in the colonies, while that wasn't the case in Britain. That was something that the British established for their colonists. So we have this like hodgepodge of so many different variations on Christianity, which all had different ideas of what they wanted to do. We've got Protestants, there's some Catholic influence, there's some Jewish sites, there's Quaker, there's Puritans, and various. Those are the ones I looked at, but there's various other denominations in there as well, which showed up really interestingly in the data. When I was looking at one of the variables I was looking at was whether the burial ground was a graveyard or not, so whether it was directly associated with a church spatially, which was what I was looking at. So the Dutch sites, the majority of them were associated with the church. There was 2 sites that weren't, but those 2 sites were only not associated with the church because they were established in such early settlements that a church hadn't even been developed yet. The French ones were all associated with a church, and there was like one that was unknown. And then the British sites were sort of in the middle. They were like, some of them were and some of them weren't, and it was kind of all over the place, which was like almost 50-50 split, which was really interesting.
So what can you, I guess, infer from the association of a burial ground with a church? And because you said that the British was kind of a hodgepodge, and I'm guessing that's in alignment with the multitude of religious beliefs and what
Mm-hmm.
have you with that. um so, like, what can you infer from the placement of these burial grounds in association or not in association with a church?
Yeah, so what it kind of is looking like is the closer a settlement or like a group of people was keeping to an older established religion, like the French Catholic beliefs didn't change too much going into the 17th century from what they had been for a long time. The closer they were to a group like that, the more they were likely to have this sort of like churchyard model, where, let's see, I don't know where the percentages are here, but yeah, so the vast majority, I think, 11 French sites I looked at were associated with the church, one unknown. So that's 100% of the data that I do have was associated with the church. And then the farther you get into religious groups that are changing, so the Dutch Reformed, they're slightly less. They're still mostly next to a church, but there's more that aren't than when you look at the French ones. And then you get to the British sites, and the Puritans are mostly not associated with the church, and the Quakers are sort of both, but they don't call theirs churches, so that's also another question mark. The British Anglican sites are beside the church most of the time, but a couple aren't, and it just sort of, the farther you get into religious groups that are deviating from like the long established, really is where you're starting to get more variation.
And what about the I guess the format of these burial grounds? Like, were they all in rows? Were people buried facing a certain specific direction? Are the gravestones all the same?
So I wasn't looking too closely at like individual graves, but from the sites that I did have some like previous archaeological excavation data to look at, the majority of them are still following the Christian tradition of burying the graves facing east-west. The gravestone styles vary by region, a lot of influence coming from the New England area, and there was some really interesting stuff going on in Montreal with I think it's Pointe de Callier is where the site is called now. Ville Marie was the earliest like sort of settlement in that area, and their earliest burial ground had a division in the middle of it, like a fence going down the middle, and there was some burials on one side of the fence that were oriented slightly differently than the directly east-west ones. And they do have records of the burials at that site, and they think that the ones that weren't oriented the same way were indigenous people that had been like had joined the mission and had converted to Christianity. So they were buried in the same space, but in like a segregated section of the burial ground.
Well, isn't that interesting?
Mm-hmm.
Huh. So, you mentioned you weren't looking specifically at the individual graves, but did you notice
Mm-hmm.
any patterns in, like you mentioned iconography before, how there was this softening of the
Yes.
iconography when cemeteries and the park-like structure, was starting to be taken up.
Mhm.
What other shifts in iconography did you notice, if at all?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a period where we don't really have much data for what the like grave markers and gravestones would have, partially because Quakers and Puritans didn't like religious iconography, so they often didn't even mark their graves, or they'd mark them with like a stick or something. So that definitely plays into what we see for the New England area. But when they did start carving gravestones, a lot of, for those groups at least, didn't have any imagery at all. So you see a lot of early gravestones, especially around Boston and like Massachusetts Bay area, that don't have any images from like the mid 1600s. They just have text, and then they slowly start to have pictures, but they are not religious pictures. So there's very often early gravestones coming out of New England, and they shipped everywhere, sort of on the Northeast. We have New England gravestones from the 18th century in Newfoundland, and they have these memento mori images of like the winged skull, excuse me, that also gets called the death's head. Sometimes the winged cherub, which is also called a soul effigy, which is supposed to supposedly represent the individual's soul. And then once the 18th century gets rolling, you get more images that are less skull, less skull-like, and more like people. You can see portraiture sometimes, and then you get into, as it rolls into the 19th century, is when we start seeing that major change to be the softer image, and then the text will change from saying like "here lies the literal body" or like the corpse of, to in memory of, or yeah, dedicated to kind of thing.
When these people came over and they started to settle, did you find that their practices were maybe being influenced by the other people in other communities?
Yeah, so I think when people were coming over from Europe, they were carrying a lot of traditions with them, but then especially the disinter groups were using us as an opportunity to be able to practice their own religion, and sort of run a community how they would have wanted to. So we're seeing a lot of new ideas being established at the same time as some groups holding up older traditions as well. Um, a lot of the time, people who settled in one area were like of a similar background. So you see a lot of Puritans and Quakers in the Massachusetts Bay Area, whereas in Quebec in the St. Lawrence Valley, River Valley, you see a lot of Catholic influence, and to this day, it's still very divided up like that. So I think that people weren't moving around quite as much as they do today, so there was a little bit less cross influence, but it definitely was there, and we can see that in the 18th century, after sort of like after the British took over Dutch New Netherlands. We see a lot of influence of British ideas and British gravestone carving styles as well appearing in the cemeteries.
Very cool. So let's talk a little bit about the work you do with your husband about restoration.
Yeah.
What is involved in that? Like, is it? I'm just picturing, growing up in the '80s where it was kind of the thing for bored kids to go in and knock over headstones. I mean, I don't get it. So, other than writing headstones, what else does your work involve?
I mean, I'm sure we're fixing a lot of problems that were caused by bored kids in the 80s, it sounds like. Uh, Unfortunately. Yeah, so we do gravestone like cleaning and uprighting, and then a lot of repair work as well. Softer stones like marble, specifically marble, and limestone will often crack and break. And if the break isn't too developed, like if it hasn't weathered away too much and is like really unstable, we'll be able to put that back together. But we also do a lot of work with heritage groups and community groups in Newfoundland. So we'll go out and we'll do workshops and teach their volunteers how to safely clean gravestones so they can like upkeep the sites for themselves in the future and teach other people. We'll do like public talks about safety in cemeteries and like history about different sites and the work we do and everything as well.
So, how do people go about like knowing that I don't know their cemetery or graveyard needs tending to? How do they contact you? What's involved?
People continuously tell us that there's no shortage of work in Newfoundland, and it's true. The joke is that every road ends in a cemetery
Oh,
in the province. I'm sure that's true in like so many places. But yeah, because European settlers have been here for so long that there's quite a history of established cemeteries and gravestone carvers and everything. So yeah, people are often like they know about what's local to them. They know about the sites that are in their community, and often people do go out and try and clean up these sites themselves as well. So if we're sort of out there making ourselves known on the internet, we haven't advertised too much, but sometimes we're like on the radio or something, and then we'll get some emails afterwards because we have a little website. But yeah, we usually just we're like out there talking about heritage, and then someone will come up to us and be like, "Oh, I work with such and such cemetery, and like I'm on the board, and can you come do a workshop for us or something?" And it usually goes from there.
cool. So, what's the number one thing that maybe well-meaning volunteers do to try to help preserve their gravestones
Mm.
and cemeteries, but is not really helping?
That could be a really long list,
Oh boy.
unfortunately.
All these
the
well-meaning things that are not helping.
Yeah, I mean, the main issue is that like conservation information, as I'm sure you know, for archaeology updates very frequently. It's like a very active field. So the information that's really available to people online, especially, is often quite outdated. I'd say the biggest issue for gravestones is that people put them in concrete. They'll try and do repairs using concrete, or they'll set the bases into concrete. And concrete is extremely difficult to remove once it's on a stone. And you can take it off sometimes, but it'll often take pieces of stone with it, and that's a huge problem. But it is not water permeable. And that's an issue when you're working with a soft historic stone because it causes water to be trapped inside of the stone, which makes it weaker in that area. So if you set a marble headstone up and down into a block of concrete, after a while, moisture can't leach out of the bottom of that stone. It's just sort of collecting there, and that weakens that area. The stone's going to break, but now the bottom piece that you need it to repair with is stuck in concrete, and we can't get it out anymore.
Okay, no concrete. Good
No
to
concrete.
know. I would not have thought of that. Okay, good
Hmm.
to um, and so people can just contact you through your website?
Yeah, the business is called Black Cat Cemetery Preservation. If you also Google my name and put gravestone after it, I'm sure something would come up as well.
I think I found you by Googling, mortuary archaeology because I really wanted to get somebody on here talking about mortuary archaeology.
There's not too many people in Canada that do mortuary archaeology as well as like public facing stuff. So yeah, it's a small pool.
Right. So why did you wanna do a PhD?
Ooh. um, I never really intended to go into academia in the sense of like being a professor. But I've always really been interested in like research and writing and that avenue of archaeology. So I did my master's and then I went to work in Ontario for a couple of years. But I still had a lot of questions from the research I did for my master's, and I thought the best way to answer them, rather than doing it on my own time while trying to work full time, would probably be to go back to school. And then there's a lot of heritage jobs in like museums and institutions that do research that even if you're not like going to be a professor, they still want you to have a doctorate. So if I'm interested in doing something like that in the future, that's like the bonus of having a doctorate in the end.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard that from others that if you want to work in the heritage, in a
Mm-hmm.
museum or one of the more, I guess, an institution, a heritage institution of whatever sorts, that you really do need a PhD.
Yeah, like there's like smaller museums and like community museums. Having a background in museum stuff is great, but if you want to work at like the Royal BC Museum and you want to be a curator of whatever, they want you to have a background, a high level background in it. So they usually ask people to have a doctorate. Yeah, so I would like those doors to be open to me in the future for sure.
Right. Yeah, especially with your consulting, you're very firmly situated within the heritage
Hmm.
sphere as far as I can see. So, yeah, that makes sense.
Trying.
Yeah, yeah. All right. Well, how when do you defend?
Oh my gosh. I talked to my supervisors recently and they said barring like a catastrophe of some sort, hopefully late spring, early summer. So I'm currently working on the last couple chapters of like editing. And then the whole thing will get compiled and sent to my supervisors for like a second review. And then if we've got any changes, make those, and then it'll be going out to my reviewer committee.
Well, damn, best of luck. That's
Thank you.
coming pretty quick. So
It is. It is. I'm like, it's December already. It's a little scary, but
I feel bad now for taking up your time. You should be
oh
writing and
no, no,
editing.
you're good.
All
It's
right.
nice
Well,
to
thank
not be
you very
editing.
much. And again, if anybody wants to reach out to you, they can just Google Robyn Lacy or your website again is Spade and Grave?
Spade in the grave, yeah.
Spade in the Grave. All right. Sounds good.
Thank you.
I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Please leave a rating or review and share this episode and podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues.